Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first EPIC training event of the academic year. I'm Julie Tennille, professor in the grad department of social work at Westchester University. After these past 4 years, EPIC is making some exciting shifts. Tonight, I'm thrilled to announce that Dr. Alison Neff will be taking on the role of principal investigator and project director. Check out Alison's bio on our EPIC website, and you'll see her impeccable qualifications reaching back to hospital-based interdisciplinary teamwork in Philly, up to her current role as clinical director of the Center for Carceral Communities and co-chair of the Westchester University Interprofessional Education Task Force. We are lucky. I'd also like to welcome Wendy Lee, our new graduate assistant. And finally, a heartfelt thank you to Wendy Myers, our EPIC program coordinator and North Star for EPIC for over 7 years. Wendy is also a valued colleague, friend, and champion of integrated care and interprofessional education. We're incredibly excited about tonight's presentation on abolition and gun violence, an innovative intervention for emerging adults. Our speakers include the multi-talented Alison Neff, TJ Ghose, Noam Keim, and James Clausell. Please see our EPIC website to read the bios on these incredible people. Okay, I'm turning this over to our team, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides.
Great. Thank you, Julie. And just while we're getting our slides shared, I just wanted to say thank you, Julie, for just all of your amazing work with the HRSA grant, with EPIC, and everything that you've done with this, and for all your support of me during this transition. Thank you so much. You're the best. So welcome. It's so good to see so many folks here, and I got to see names as people were coming in, and lots of familiar names and faces. So thanks for being here this evening. We're going to do just a quick round of introductions, and then we'll get started. So I'll go first. My name is Alison Updyke-Neff, and I am an associate professor of graduate social work at Westchester. I'm also the clinical director at the Center for Carceral Communities. So that means that I do clinical work there. I get to help facilitate groups, work one-on-one with people sometimes, and then also do some supervision for social workers and interns and folks like that. My background is mostly in social work. I've been a social worker for a long time, and prior to my work at the center, I worked for about 10 years in the child welfare system, both kind of in a case management capacity and then shifting more into mental health, and spent lots of years doing mental health. And then I also worked in a hospital setting, as Julie mentioned, doing mostly ER and trauma work, but some other things there as well. So I've kind of been all over with social work, and yeah, I'm going to turn it over to TJ.
Hi, everybody. I almost automatically went to my first mode, which is to invite everybody to do introductions, but we'll forego that. Okay. There's a lot of people here, and I'm so happy to see every one of you. Um, my name is TJ Ghose. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. I do see some old students here, which is awesome. Hi, Beth. Hi, Pega. If there are more that I haven't seen, hi, everybody. That's awesome to see all of you. I helped to co-found the Center for Carceral Communities with Alison, and work there pretty much. That's where my social work is outside of being a professor at Penn. And a lot of my work is with really, um, what I would term chronically incarcerated communities, such as sex workers and substance users and the homeless. A lot of my work is in Philadelphia through the center, but the center also works in other areas of the country. We do work with the homeless in New York City, and I do work with sex worker communities in India. some of you have been with me to classes in India where we work with sex workers along similar kind of conditions. In fact, some of this that you're going to listen to today is based on some work that we have done with sex work communities across the world. Thank you for allowing me to be here. It's my privilege. I will turn this over next to Noam.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Noam Keim, they, them pronouns. I'm the reentry and diversion manager at the center, and I've been in this role for 6 years now. So what I do is that I co-facilitate groups, provide support services to our community, develop programs, like really day-to-day operations, training people, et cetera, et cetera. I come from a very different background. I have a master's degree in American visual culture from Parisian University, because I moved to the US 10 years ago after grad school. I have been in movement spaces for my entire adult life. And when I moved to the US, I started working to dismantle prisons in Pennsylvania specifically. First at Books Through Bars, where I was using my previous degree in library science to support people who were incarcerated, and then doing work around ending life without parole in Pennsylvania. And I'm part of like healing justice spaces, and I'm also an herbalist, a published nonfiction writer. So I'm coming at it from a very different angle than social work, and ended up here as part of this team. And I get to introduce the last member of our presentation, James Clausell, who is muted.
Okay, I see. Hello, everyone. My name is James Clausell. I'm a criminal justice major at Rutgers University. I became affiliated with the Center for Cross Community 4 years ago. And since that time, I've been working with them, effectuating some of the programs and facilitating groups.
James, I'm just going to remind you that you are, in fact, not a criminal justice major. You are a criminal justice degree holder now as you as a graduate.
I'll keep my eye on the master, though. That's what I'm focused on.
Well, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. Great.
Throughout.
So I'm going to start us off. I think, no, I don't know if the slide, it's not advanced on our screen. Sometimes it does that where it'll like, you might need to give it a little, there we go. Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna start off by just giving a quick overview of the Center for Carceral Communities, which is where this team works together. And so just give you like a little bit of an idea of where we're coming from. So as TJ mentioned, we co-founded the center in 2015. So it's been almost 10 years. We keep saying we need to do something special to celebrate 10 years, but mostly our physical location was in West Philadelphia and kind of focusing on West Philadelphia, although really accessible to anyone in the Philadelphia area. We practice from an orientation that we call like an abolitionist harm reduction framework. And I'm going to say more about that. I think probably some of those words are familiar to people, but I'll share more about sort of what exactly we mean by that. One thing about our services and support at the center is that everything is free. And so we really do try to make everything as accessible as possible to people. And we practice from evidence-based approaches that I'll say more about in just a second. And we do both virtual and sort of in-person contact with folks. We started out kind of more in person. I think like a lot of places experienced some shifts during the pandemic, and now kind of do a blend of both. So we love an acronym at the center. And so we have a couple that I want to share with you. The first one, just to kind of give you a little overview of sort of the interventions that we practice from and kind of what our frameworks are. So the first one, GAINS, is really sort of describing our kind of structural approach to practice. And so you can see here on the left, the G in GAINS is for groups, and groups are really our primary modality at the center. And there are a few reasons for that. We'll talk about some of those more as we go along, but it's really important to create opportunities for folks to collectivize, particularly when people are impacted by things that are sort of highly stigmatized, or when folks are really marginalized. Like, collective spaces are incredibly important. And so some of the advantages of group that we talk about are this idea of collective identity. So again, when people are particularly experiencing something highly stigmatized, being able to collectivize in a space where a different identity that is sort of counter to the stigmatized narrative that folks are experiencing is possible is really important. It also just gives us a chance to build community. As Noam said, we have folks coming from really different perspectives. And so while we do provide services at the center, service provision is not necessarily the main approach that we have, and really like community building, collectivizing, and creating a space where people can come together to provide support and to just be people in each other's lives is one of the most important goals. We do use a clinical model for our groups called chats, which we also use for case management, and I will talk about that in just a second. A couple of things I want to say about the A in GAINS, which is advocacy. This is really, I think, advocacy happens on a few different levels. And so one that I want to really draw forward for just a quick minute is this idea of radical confidentiality. And this is both, I think, of as kind of an individual level advocacy and also a system level, more structural point of advocacy. One of the things that I have seen a ton as a social worker, and I'm sure many of you have as well, is that we tend to be expected in systems to share information about people because they are receiving services. So kind of this idea that if someone is, receiving services or involved in systems, then their information is no longer confidential. And so we really thought a lot about how we wanted to approach confidentiality, particularly working with the criminal legal system and with courts and having so many potential demands on information access and things like that. And so this is sort of one of those things where we call it radical confidentiality, because what was called confidentiality really wasn't being practiced as confidentiality. But what we actually mean by radical confidentiality is just regular respecting folks' rights to confidentiality. But what that means is that we do not share information about people with the system without their permission ever. And that is something, and again, with their permission only when that's something that's helpful to them. So sometimes it's helpful to people to say, yes, they've been engaged in our program because, that gives them credit with their PO or something like that, with their probation officer. But we really are very, very, very adamant about this. This means that things that are said in group stay in the group. We do not share things. And I think this is one of the ways that we are able to earn and keep trust with people who sometimes have had experiences that make it difficult for them to be trusting. And so I really want to bring that point forward. But also in terms of advocacy, just sort of this like flexible approach to case management and crisis intervention, when we can really step into situations if people do have challenges that come up in terms of contact with the legal system, stepping in to really advocate for people. And what we've found is that sometimes the greatest predictor of whether someone is reincarcerated is less their individual behavior and more whether they have someone to help them navigate situations when they happen. And so that advocacy is incredibly important. And then the INS in GAINS stands for Integrated Network of Services. And this is where we really intentionally reach out and build relationships with community partners, even with folks in systems that you might not imagine. People who are practicing from kind of an abolitionist orientation might build relationships with, like the DA's office or the courts. And we'll talk more about sort of why and how we do that. But the idea is really that without a network of support and opportunities and referral spots and all kinds of things like that, our opportunity to support people is really limited. And so we build those networks and kind of make sure that, we have a rule that we never refer anyone anywhere that we haven't spoken to someone, that we don't know what's going to happen when they get there. And then quickly looking over here to the right, chats is our clinical model. And this is a kind of motivational interviewing and CBT-based intervention. People who've been in class with me have heard more about this, but as you can see, the acronym here, we talk about challenges, what's coming up for people, alternatives to those challenges. We talk about triumphs, things that are going well, opportunities people have had to work through challenges, and then also solutions moving forward. What I would say about chats, I think that's most important, is that it's a transparent model. And what that means is that we talk about it. So in group and in case management support, that's something that we're referencing, that people know, they know what chats means. And so this is, I think, an important thing, because, we talk in social work about how we want to work ourselves out of a job, right? We want people to be empowered to become their own social workers or their own therapists. And so this is an important way that we implement this intervention, that folks really become familiar with it. And, it's not unusual for people to encounter challenges outside of group and kind of come and say, I sort of worked through this, or I chats to myself, and here's, what I have to share with the group. I'm going to kick it over to Noam to talk about relational case management.
So yeah, let's talk about relational case management, which is a big piece of what we're doing. As Alison was mentioning, one of the big things at the center is that we're really trying to build community and also support people in feeling empowered. And part of it, right, we have our group that happens weekly, and then we have individual support that we never call case management. Just to be honest with you, that is not a word that we use with our participants. I've had multiple community members who at some point were like, wait, you're my case manager? I thought we were just kicking it. And it's kind of what we're doing, right? And the reason why people often get confused about it being case management is because a big part of my role and the role of the staff of the center is to not make it feel like it's case management for a number of reasons. And we'll start from the beginning, which is that at the center, because we work with people who have been deeply impacted by the criminal system, that means that we work with people who have a lot of institutional trauma, who have seen plenty of service providers before, who have let them down or who have hurt them, right, in a number of different ways. So of course, they're very hesitant to start a relationship with a service provider, and they're traumatized. So a big part of our job is to create a relationship so that people can build towards their objectives and goals and dreams and, aspirations. And when I say part of the job, really, it's actually an orientation, right? Just to be very clear, that's the way we want to be doing it. And the way I always talk about it is that, as an immigrant, somebody who moved to this country without family or without a support system, one of the things that I often thought about when I moved to the US was, if my house is on fire at 2 a.m, who do I call, right? And I didn't really have people. And a lot of people in our community were, because we're dealing with people impacted by the criminal system, are Black men, Philadelphia Black men, right? Who often are in situations where their communities are pretty sparse. We work with people who either came home from prison, but like for the purpose of this presentation, we work with a lot of like younger people who don't have strong communities, or who have communities that are really great for doing certain things, but maybe not being the best at dealing with a house on fire at 2 a.m, right? And so part of our role at the center is to be that person that you could call at 2 a.m or 3 a.m when the house is on fire. And one of the things that I've learned over the years that I think is really important is that I can't assume that I'm a safe person for somebody I'm working with. I have to work towards that, right? I can't just be like, hey, buddy, you should trust me, and that will just happen like that, right? There's a lot of things that come out of that are like setting this up. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is part of that, right? Like an individual approach. I know the astrological sign of every single person who comes to the center. That's not a joke. I usually know that. you know, their parents, their families, going to the cookouts, like all those things are part of actually, you know, the relationship at the center. And each person who comes to the center has a different need. And that means that every single person will experience something different with us at the center, right? In terms of case management, some people need to be like, they need to talk to somebody every day. Some people need once a week. Some people need once a month. It doesn't matter, right? Some people want to go to college and some people need a job that's like tomorrow, right? Whatever people need, we'll figure it out together, right? And I think that like one of the really important things with that is that I will say that one of my superpowers, and I think that like it's a superpower that a lot of people can develop for themselves, is this idea that like seeing a person for who they are and where they're at also allows you to see what their potential is. Like, who is this person? What are their dreams? What are their skills? What are they actually good at? And like, because we're not in a situation of crisis, we're not in a situation where, you know, my needs are met every day. So I'm able to like look at the future for them, supporting them and moving towards that future that I can envision for them, right? And as I'm saying this, right, of course, a lot of it has to do with regular case management. But I think that like one of the main differences with regular case management is that it's actually like we're working as a team. I don't have any, you know, I don't do an intake on paper. It's literally just a conversation. People have my personal cell phone number. And that's how we work. We work as a team. And I'm going to tell you a story that might help you understand like part of what we're doing. A few years ago, I went to Maryland where there's this national forest that's part of the Harriet Tubman National Monument. And if you've never been there, it's really cool. You should definitely go. And one of the things that I've learned at this, you know, there's like a ranger station and there's like a little museum. And one of the things that I didn't know, partially because I'm not American and didn't go to school in the US, is I learned a little bit more about the reasons why Harriet Tubman did things the way she did. And Harriet Tubman was an herbalist who knew the landscape of her particular region really well, because on Sundays she would go from different plantation to visit family members. And so she knew the trees, she knew the marshes, she knew the plants. And when she started freeing people, who were in her community. And the reason why she was able to free them was because of her extremely deep knowledge of the landscape that she had grew up in. I don't know if you've ever been to Maryland, but that's a lot of marshes. And I know I would not be able to navigate that, but she knew how to do that. And when I was there and listening to all of that, I was really thinking about it because as somebody who has been organizing for a really long time, I see a lot of people really struggling with this idea of like, wow, there's like all those like really big issues, right? Like we're trying to dismantle prisons, we're trying to dismantle the machine. And I'm one of the people who sometimes gets really defeated by that. But what Harriet Tubman taught me is that when you're able to do something with the people around you really well and know your landscape really well, you can actually free a lot of people and you can plant the seeds for other people to come after you, right? And obviously, I'm no Harriet Tubman. I don't want you to think that this is where we're going with this. But this is like a lesson that I think was really important for me. And really important for me also because case management as one of the feminized labors is often really devalued by a lot of people, right? Like being able to like help somebody get a job or help somebody like navigate even just SEPTA or whatever is often looked down upon as like not good enough or not clinical work. And I'm not a clinician, but I would argue that the reason why it's devalued is because it's feminized labor and it's small. And I really believe that those small things are really important. And that's why relational case management feels really crucial to me when we're working with our clients. And as part of our like relational case management, I want to offer you the social discipline window, which is one of my favorite things to teach to people. When I saw it the first time, I was like, oh, this is so helpful. Because before I came to the center, I worked for a large nonprofit working with immigrants. I taught English, and then I became a case manager. And what I often saw was people, so, on the social discipline window, you have the axis of accountability. So boundaries, consequences, sometimes on the carceral end of the spectrum, right? Like punitive. And the other axis is support, right? Encouragement, nurturing, material support, et cetera, et cetera. If you're looking at, somebody who receives neither accountability nor support, we would be in the neglectful quadrant, right? Which is nobody is like paying attention to you, you're not receiving anything. But often, what I've seen of service providers in the unnamed nonprofit I worked at is that people would receive a lot of accountability, right? A lot of consequences, a lot of like, you need to do it this way and that way and blah, blah, blah. And if you don't do it this way, there will be consequences, but no support to actually achieve the things that they were asked to do. And that's where we're entering the punitive quadrant, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a tendency that sometimes, that is like a really well-meaning one, and sometimes just as dangerous, in my opinion, than the punitive one, which is a lot of support with no accountability, right? We're going to give you, but we're not going to hold you accountable for your actions, which is often really condescending, if I'm being honest with you. And what we're trying to do at the center with relational case management and with the ways that we're building our community is to be in the restorative quadrant, which is high support, right? Whatever you need, we're going to make it happen, but with a high level of accountability. I often say that to people in our community. I might not love you every day. You might get on my nerves, and I will tell you when you're doing too much and you're really being annoying, because people are annoying, and that's part of the job. And people who are traumatized are often like, not always with the best social skills. And at the same time, I will love you unconditionally, and we will get to whatever you need together, right? But very high accountability, very high level of support. And that creates really strong relationships. And maybe I will end it here and pass it over to my buddy, James Clausell. And I will stop sharing my screen for a second because I have a feeling I'm going to need to tell you to unmute yourself.
It's already unmuted. Great.
There you go.
Hey,
Yeah.
hello, everyone. I often listen to this story when she talked about this because I'm so far removed from the knowledge of the clinical aspect of it. So it was always a learning experience for me as well. I was arrested at the age of 20 and charged with murder. It was my first offense. Never even had a juvenile record. And so the state was seeking the death penalty. In my young adolescent mind, there was nowhere in the world that I was going to get the death penalty. That's like, I've never been in trouble before. I had all these scenarios played out in my head, but I was actually sentenced to death a year later after I was arrested. The jury determined that I wasn't no longer fit to live among society. So after 5 years on death row, my conviction was reversed. I was retried, and I was later sentenced to 31 and a half years to life. Appeal after appeal, I fought my convictions, court after court, getting little victories here and there, but nothing to change or effectuate the sentence. So after 31 and a half years, I became eligible for parole. I saw the parole board, denied, given a hit, instructed to take programs. For the most part, programs in prisons are a joke. Really are a joke in more ways than one, because the guys, we take them because we're told we have to do these things in order to be eligible for certain things. So when guys attend, they laugh, they joke, you don't get anywhere. So when I became eligible again, I went before the board, got another hit, told to take more programs again. I became exhausted. The third time up, now we're approaching 36 years. before I go in, an individual who actually committed the crime with which I was charged with, he told them that he did it. And so they released me. I was released from parole. I didn't go to a halfway house or anything. I released right to the street with a condition. Because I was incarcerated all those years, they figure I was traumatized, I needed help. And I'm like, what? So this parole officer who seen this flyer that someone left at the office, she gives me this flyer to attend this program out in West Philadelphia. I'm like, I live all the way up here, the other end of the city. And I had to go down to this program. I was already like, had enough of the system. The system had just wore me out. I didn't want to have nothing to do with it. So this little paper I got, you know, I was bitter. So I get down to the center and I come in bitter. I come in hot. I had enough of the system, enough of everything connected to it. Because that's how we see everyone. We see anyone that's connected to the system as part of the system. But when I first walked in the door, one of the things that caught me was this liberation sign on the wall. I was like, what the hell is this? Like, it's not a state thing you normally see connected with parole or anything. So I went in the meeting and I was just still bitter, sitting back, listening to people talk. I just wanted to get it over with. I didn't want nothing to do with it. Social workers, over the years, they had really turned me off because they wasn't really doing anything. They was just there to collect a paycheck, and social workers are perceived to be just part of the system, another leg of the system. And after all that time, all that I've been through, the last thing I wanted to do was be bothered with anything else connected with the system. And I kind of took it out on them. I wouldn't associate with them. I wouldn't talk. I was just like, I'm just going to get through this. I came in real hard. But through observation, I started watching you because you do have perception that you develop over the years. And I started seeing something different. I started seeing people act and behave in ways that was contrary to all my ideas and beliefs as far as what social workers and what people do, because everybody talk the talk, but nobody really walks the walk as far as doing anything. But I saw them actually attentive to the people in the group, caring about them, actually looking them in the eye when they talked. I'm like, yo, what the hell is this? So as time went on, I really became enamored with it. You didn't have to, I wasn't grumbling no more to go. I was looking forward to go. And then long after it was over, I was still attending because I loved the work they was doing. When we're on the inside, we have a tendency to believe that people on the outside don't care. So how could this possibly happen to us on the inside if anybody on the outside cared? So we had this thing about society as a whole that kind of hardens us. And we see everyone as just someone else is to take another bite out of us or something, or another pound of flesh to be demanded. But I started working with them and I started seeing the things they were doing. They really cared. And all I ever wanted to do was to make sure that no one experienced what I experienced. No one went through what I went through. And I found a group and an organization that goals were consistent with mine, that actually wanted to do something, wanted to effectuate change. And so I found a home there because everything was real, contrary to everything that I imagined. So I ended up staying on, eager to help or assist in any way I could with the facilitation. And magically, I didn't know initially that I was even getting treatment. Like, I was just there. But when the report was given to the parole and I was like, what? Treatment? What do you mean treatment? Assessment.
Hey, hold up. Let's just be clear. There was no details about anything in this letter.
No, it was a letter that I had to give them to show that I was attending. And in the letter, it was like they mentioned the fact that I was doing this and doing that, and I was doing fine, but I didn't even know that they were even looking at me in that way, that I was actually getting treatment, assessments, and everything else. It was like I was actually shocked. You get treated. It's like eating a meal and you don't even know you're eating it. How is that possible? How am I full and I'm not eating no meal? So at the end of the day, I saw that there was actually something that existed that was consistent with my ideas of belief, and it gave me an opportunity to try to, make a difference.
So do you want to tell the people how long ago that was? Because I think that that's the most hilarious part of it.
It's about 4 years ago. 4 years ago. That's how long it was. And I've been Well, I'm not just myself. A lot of people, once they hear at the center, they don't leave.
Yeah.
Other people come through, we stay because we finally, like I said, it's different when you see someone really care, because most people are even say that I'm just doing their job, but not even really doing their job. But when you see the kind of people that's there, the work that they're doing, and they're actually trying to make a difference, because what you care about or how much you care about depends upon what you do about it. They're not there for the money. I knew that, because this is a thankless job. But the thing about it is that what's important for me is that social workers, they don't know crime is a social phenomenon. It's not natural things that take place in the community. But you had to ask yourself, what causes these things? What bring them about? I've studied on the inside, and there's nothing been more studied than communities, what they call it, social bonding, all the sociological things that they've been doing over all these years. They know the information, but it's never been practiced. I've never seen anyone actually do anything about it. They actually implemented a lot of the changes that actually change people's lives. And I've actually been witness to giving birth to people all over again, to new people that come through that door. And when they finish, they're changed. And so I know that if it did it for me, someone who was anti-everything, if it turned me around, I knew that it could probably help almost anyone else. So that's why I became committed.
Spoken like a true Sagittarius.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like we'll talk more about what that looks like concretely in a little bit. But first,
Yeah.
maybe it's time for TJ to come on and tell us more about the center and like the orientation of the center. So TJ, I'm gonna bring you on.
Thank you, Noam. Hold on. Trying to get this thing out. Okay. So, and just so you know that we are truly an interdisciplinary team from various perspectives, I am a social worker first and foremost, but I also have a background in physics. So every time Noam starts talking about Sagittarius and the stars, that's not astrophysics, but astral physics. I'm rolling my eyes till they're uncannily accurate about how things work out. So there you have it. There's much I learned from the interdisciplinary aspect of this. So we wanted to give you kind of we're doing this in cycles, and then the first cycle, I'm kind of finishing up our first cycle of presentations, and we'll go back and recycle and have us present again. In this cycle, we're trying to give you an overview of how we think, how we work as a team, even give you a sense of interactionally how we are with each other. But I want to move now into a program that kind of brings it all together, the abolitionist orientation that we have, the harm reductionist orientation that we have, and the team interdisciplinary aspect that we have, and apply it to gun diversion. We have a program called the Alternative Felony Diversion Program, a very fancy way and kind of a political strategic way of say gun diversion. Just to show you and give you a sense of how this all comes together concretely, and how we're thinking about this. Noam, if you can start the slide. Thank you. So just to give you a sense of where we are, we're at the epicenter of two epidemics here. For the incarceration is one of them. And the US national rates of incarceration, which are some of the highest in the world, the US incarcerates more people than any country in the history of humanity, okay, by far. And that's at 664 per 100,000. Philadelphia's rates, mind you, these are US rates that are sky high. Philadelphia's rates are way more than that, 810 per 100,000. For African Americans in Philadelphia, that's even more. That's twice the US rates at 1,267 per 100,000. For Philadelphia men, specifically for Black men, it's 1,467. And if you add in Philadelphia jails, I won't go into this, but the jails don't look too much. In fact, they're worse than prison sometimes because you're spending a lot of time in jails because it's so slow. You're now at 2,168. That's about 2% of the population. And in the infectious diseases field, we consider 1% to be an epidemic. So just imagine that. At the height of the HIV epidemic, the population level epidemic, we were about at a 1.8%, and 2% is a massive epidemic right now. Next one, Noah, thanks. The crime rates, that's the other epidemic. We all know that we are a high crime city. We're being told that constantly, right? The national violent crime rate is at 369 per 100,000. Philadelphia's rate is 811. And the national gun-related homicides, 11.1, that's 1/3 of Philadelphia's gun-related homicides. While that has gone down recently, it is still a sky-high rate. Next. Actually, let me just come out of this for a second. I want to just tell you a little bit about the fact that both of these are extremely difficult and problematic epidemics to deal with. And gun diversion in particular, which you would assume given this epidemic of gun violence, would be a natural, but it's never on the table because it is absolutely the third rail of social work and of politics. So you will not find actual gun diversion programs. There are a lot of programs that call themselves gun diversion, but actual gun diversion programs will not be something that you will find on any political or care providing agenda. One of the reasons for that is because of the stigma. We do have a hierarchy of stigma of who commits crimes. You smoke weed, yeah, that is something that we would likely have a diversion program. Substance use, maybe. Sex work, maybe. But guns, a use of guns, that is the least deserving of everybody, right? For various reasons. We'll come to that and question that. Liability. We do not want to become part of the incarcerated regime as care providers ourselves. Carceral politics are such that they percolate right through and start to tinge us if the persons we provide care for start to then use guns, then we become liable for that. So that carcerality, we do not want to have anything to do with it. So it's difficult to find people or agencies taking up that liability. The other portion of this is that, Lloyd Wakant, who was quite an amazing, social scientist, one of the MacArthur geniuses, wrote about the fact that reentry and diversion programs are often problematic, as James said, because they tend to kind of build on their own legitimacy rather than doing good work. And so the liability issue makes it an issue because if you're ticking off the box, most agencies will say, we can't handle this. It's difficult work. Can I go back to the slides? I want to talk to you a little bit about how this plays out conceptually for us. If look at the two epidemics. One is a gun violence epidemic. When you have an experience of violence, we know through a lot of literature in the field that experiences of violence, of being exposed to gun violence, result in high levels of depression and anxiety, which then result in impulsivity, which is directly related to using guns if they're available, which they are. Similarly, adult attachment is severely undermined when you have a situation where you're being incarcerated regularly. The lack of adult attachment, we know, also results in depression and anxiety, which also results in impulsivity, which also then results in high gun violence. So these are all interconnected. And so what we did with all of this is we took the information and we started applying it, knowing we wanted to be a gun diversion program. I mean, that's one of the things we wanted to do. And we started a program, which you'll hear a lot about. But initially, when we started the program for gun diversion, for people who are being admitted for a gun felony for the first time, we wanted to see if this particular model of association holds. And so if you go to the next slide, Noam, what we saw was this is actually quite true. Amongst our people at the baseline, when they were being admitted, we found a high association of the experience of violence, which many of them, 80% of them had been exposed to some form of violence, and almost half of them had been exposed to being held up by a gun. It was highly correlated with psychiatric symptoms, mental illness. Almost 50% of our folks had an SMI diagnosis, which was also highly correlated with impulsivity. We also found that adult attachment was at a very low level when they came in. As you can imagine, they were not attached with each other or with the community because they'd been incarcerated, or there are various ways in which gun violence creates fear for any forms of attachment. And that led to psychiatric symptoms, which also led to impulsivity. In fact, fully 50% of this association, don't let your eyes glaze over, was explained through mental illness, whereas 50% was explained directly. The next one, Noam. And to kind of bring us to an end of my cycle of presentation, I just want to give you an overview of what we've done with the AFT program and its final results. I want to give away the final results already because we want to focus in the next cycle on how we did what we did. Final results I got to tell you, were mind-blowing for us too. And it's not because we were doing such a great job. It's because the community in the center, as you just saw, came together around this. So the program ran for 2021 to 2024. It was a pre-sentencing program. So before anyone was sentenced, they were in the program, and they were in the program for 6 to 9 months. There were status hearings with the judge, with the judges, various judges in the program, every 4 to 6 weeks. Don't worry, we'll explain how we got everybody on board in a bit. Our stakeholders were from various factions of the criminal injustice system: the judges, the DA, the PD, the center, of course. And once they completed the program, they were the case was just stopped. It did not move ahead, and they were eligible for expungement, which many of them went through. 203 people were successfully enrolled and completed the program. Out of them, 4 people were incarcerated in a period of 2 years. And our follow-up has been 6 months to 2 years because they've been there've been cohorts coming through. And over 2 years, 4 people were incarcerated. That's less than 2%. And I want to compare this to a successful program, or one that is touted as a successful program in Chicago, which has a reincarceration rate. Based on our program, they implemented it there, and they have a reincarceration rate of 30%. And to compare it to normal rates, you have, within a period of 1 year, almost everybody in a diversion program is reincarcerated. And we have 0 violent gun-related offenses. So it works. I mean, it works. But the question is how. And for that, I want to throw it over to Alison to talk a little bit about our orientation.
Thanks, TJ. So I want to take you kind of quickly through some of these concepts that we talked about, this orientation that we practice from at the center, which we talk about as an abolitionist harm reduction orientation. So to do that, I kind of wanted to just quickly talk through what is abolition, what is harm reduction, and then what does it mean when we kind of bring these together for our practice at the center. So first, when we talk about abolition, we're really talking about eliminating the current carceral system as it exists now. And there are a lot of reasons for that. As you can see here, the mass incarceration as it exists now is a massive driver of social and economic inequality and racial segregation, right? Like, this seeks to impoverish people, to keep people impoverished, and to restrict in all of these ways folks' ability to kind of reintegrate into society afterwards, right? We see the impact of criminal records that people have in terms of housing, in terms of education, employment, all of these things. So the segregation, of course, happens as a result of incarceration, but also even after incarceration, right? The way that people are continue to be segregated. Folks might be familiar with this idea. Michelle Alexander talked about mass incarceration system as the new Jim Crow. And I think to sort of drive that home, TJ shared a lot of really powerful statistics about how many people are incarcerated right now and how many people in Philadelphia are incarcerated. But just to underscore that further, in this analogy to Jim Crow, there are more Black folks who are incarcerated or surveilled by the system, right, in prison, jail, and probation and parole right now than there were enslaved during the peak of slavery, right, before the Civil War. There are more Black folks incarcerated by this system in some capacity. And so the impact is just impossible to overstate. And I want to sort of reiterate that, in this way, the system is really doing actually exactly what it was designed to do, right? The system isn't broken and needing to be fixed or needing to be reformed. The system is actually acting exactly as it was built to act. And one of the ways that we see that is that generally, crime rates have trended down for a long time, and yet incarceration rates have risen, right? So how is that and why is that? And again, I think the system is really, really successfully doing exactly what it was designed to do. I also just wanted to say that when we talk about abolition, sometimes people sort of say, like, what do you do? Just open the doors to all of the prisons, and that might be a part of it, right? But also that's not the whole idea of abolition. Abolition is really like a radical reimagining of what our society could look like. It's a massive redistribution of all of these funds that we spend surveilling, arresting, prosecuting, incarcerating people, and investing those in communities so that people have their needs met. And so we have a radically sort of different society. And so this abolition really is a social movement. And at the center, that's really how we relate to this idea of abolition. Is this is a social movement that's sort of informed by these other social movements. And this is particularly important for social work and for other helping professions, because we work in these roles and in these systems where we are constantly co-opted into basically functioning as cops. And James talked about this a lot when he kind of shared about his experiences with social workers. It's no surprise that a lot of people who've had a lot of contact with social workers are kind of like, no way, right? Because in so many of these roles, we get co-opted into surveilling and monitoring clients and reporting on them and kind of being this like friendly social worker arm of the carceral system. And so when we're talking about abolition at the center and as a social work practice, we're also talking about resisting those forces that cause social workers to become cops. So that idea of radical confidentiality that we talked about, right? Constantly protecting the rights and privacy of our clients and kind of resisting this alignment with the system where we surveil and monitor and report, and instead aligning with our clients and with the community. Similarly, when we talk about harm reduction, we are again talking about a social movement, right? And the idea of harm reduction is that you remove judgment to reduce harm and reduce mortality risk. So it's this question of like, what is the greatest threat to people and how can we go towards that? And in the HIV era, we saw this with regard to injection drug use, right? And that was really this like, again, kind of highly stigmatized third rail. Nobody wanted to touch that. And I think it very much like that, we see that with gun diversion or, illegal gun carrying now. And so, and this idea that incarceration actually poses the greatest risk to people. And so what does it look like to reduce the harm that people experience from this system, really by any means, right? How do we keep people out of prison, whatever we have to do that? And so thinking about, again, this idea of harm reduction and how we kind of apply those principles of harm reduction to our social work practice and to other helping professions. And so just a couple points there. First, recognizing the structural forces that impact who is most vulnerable to these systems, right? So something that we sometimes talk about is that not all harm is not all things that cause harm are illegal, and not all things that are illegal cause harm, right? And that many of the things that are punished by incarceration and that are considered illegal are actually sort of survival things that people engage in when they don't have their basic needs met, right? So recognizing who is most vulnerable to incarceration for those reasons. Also, just engaging in non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services and resources. So how can we engage with people through these sort of relational case management strategies, et cetera, in a way that is truly helpful, right? And not sort of just taking advantage of like, we easily could have said like, you know what, James has to be here. And so we don't have to, right? But instead, rather than this sort of coercive thing, how can we take a different approach to actually meeting the needs of people rather than, as this says, like sort of ticking the box of just managing things. And then of course, also including the voices of folks who are impacted by the system in sort of the creation and like running of programs. So bringing these ideas of abolition and harm reduction together, we have sort of 3 principles that I want to share with you quickly around this idea of abolitionist harm reduction. So the first one is practices that really counter the surveillance, the sanctions, and the management processes of the carceral state. And this idea of the social change principle is this question of, is the work that we're doing social management or part of social change, right? And how can we constantly be evaluating that and ensuring that we're staying in this zone of social change versus social management? And the difference between that, I think, is social management looks like sometimes managing people, people who are identified as risky to society in order to keep everyone else safe, versus social change, in which we ask, what are the conditions, the social conditions that are actually underlying these challenges that are happening, and how can we go after the social conditions rather than going after the people who are impacted by the social conditions? So that's the first one, the social change principle. The second thing talks about reducing and ideally eliminating harm perpetrated by the carceral state. And so thinking about this idea of multi-level change principle. So how can we affect change at these different levels? So we have this clinical work that we do at the center where we're doing individual, again, we don't always call it case management, but these individual relationships in which we're providing kind of tailored support to people based on where they are and what their needs are. Also this sort of group and community level intervention, and then also intervening with the system, intervening sometimes politically through, maybe getting involved in the district attorney's race so that we have a progressive DA that will make these kinds of programs possible in the first place, right? But how can we be constantly targeting the harm perpetrated by the system at each of these levels? And then lastly, this idea of incremental paradigmatic change, this constant change principle. So the idea that that the harm caused by the system is constant, and so our resistance to that harm is also constant, right? And how can we be intervening with the logics of the system? So one of the things about this AFD program I think that's so powerful is that it not only, yes, like freeing 200 people from these charges is a massive impact, right? But we also are asking the system to think differently and to apply different logics to what makes sense. So rather than a punitive logic, or rather than a sort of deserving and undeserving logic, we're bringing a really different and human and abolitionist logic into the system. And that is also part of this kind of structural change. I think we're going to transition now, Noam, to you and to James. We can unshare. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to you two.
Okay, so now let's talk about AFD. It's really funny, as we're talking, I just received a text message from a kid who graduated from AFD 6 months ago, who was just wanted to check in and ask me how I was doing. And I was like, oh, you have some superpowers because we're literally talking about you. It's very cute. And I think that like the exchange that I'm having with him in this specific moment is very indicative of what we're doing, because he just told me that he's on a Zoom call for the trade he's been trying to get into, which is really sweet, because that was something that he was struggling with, was to figure out who he wanted to be in this world. And maybe I can tell you the story about this kid, because I think that like it will help us talk about case management a little bit and get us started. So in the AFD program, we had a few social workers, and this kid was really struggling with connecting with his social worker. And so I stepped in and we talked for a little bit, and and he was telling me about, he's a Libra. I remembered this. He loves working out. And one of his big goals was that he needed to move out of his mom's house, and he needed to save money. But the reason he couldn't save money is because he was smoking way too much weed, and all the money he was making from his job was going into weed. And Allison remembers this. I made a deal with this kid, which was, because he's a Libra, the deal was that he decided the amount of money he wanted to save every week. And the way we're gonna hold him accountable was that every week in group, we would ask him, did you save the amount of money? And it was a range. It was like between 50 and 150 a week, whatever it was. And he chose the range, right? And he could choose wherever he wanted in that week. And that if he didn't do it, for the group would roast him for a minute. Like would just like, it would be a free for all, a minute of like roasting him. And what's hilarious about this is like, first of all, he loved the idea and he was like, yeah, this is what's going to motivate me. And so we agreed to do that. And what's hilarious about it is that there's many weeks where this kid did not save his money. And there was a free for all for him to be roasted, and nobody roasted him. We always talked about it as like this threat of like this thing that was going to be happening, but it just never happened because the community, like him saying, I didn't save the money, and people being like, well, we should be roasting you, was enough for him to feel accountable to the group and not just to me, right? And the little gag is that when this entire crew graduated from AFD, we agreed that I would give them 5 minutes to roast me on the Zoom. That was our last Zoom, and I was like, you get 5 minutes to roast me. And I will say some people were very good at it. There's some of those like bars that are still stuck in my head. But I think that like the reason why I'm thinking about this and thinking about this kid is that like if we're thinking again about this social discipline window, I think that like I want us to like be very clear that like it's not just being accountable to me, right? Like this high accountability, high support. It's not just like me. I'm just like some random ass person that people will probably never see again, right? It doesn't matter, right? But because the way we set up AFD is that people came in cohorts, right? So we ran 12 cohorts of AFD, because we had to skip a few numbers, but like, yeah, we had 12 total. And in each cohort, we had between 15 and 20, sometimes 21 people, because the DA's office really added a few people in there. And they all started the program at the same time. And the way we set it up is that we would meet them in court, prep them to see their judge for the first time. That's the first time that they would meet us. So they would meet us in court, which is really hard because they're just like, who the fuck are you? You work for the system, right? And then go to court with them so that they can, because they would have to sign the paper and like be sworn in, whatever. And then after that, get them to come to their first virtual group. And from that point on, we would be with them for at least 6 months, right? Where weekly they would come to group. We would like support them with whatever. And every status, which was every 4 to 6 weeks, we would bring in what we call the treatment plan, but was really a thing that we made up for them, which was like their goals and where they were at with their goals, which is a document that we always worked on with our participants, right? So there was never a thing that we would put on there that people wouldn't know about. So each person had things that they were working on, right? And we would be working together for 6 months, at least until they graduated. And for them to graduate it, that means that like the DA's office and the judge felt like, you know, they weren't a threat to society or whatever, right? Anyways, and so that means that like for 6 months, weekly, all our participants would be in a group together, a cohort of 15 to 20 people where they would see each other weekly, right? So there's like the accountability and support from the center, but there's also the group that creates its own community, culture, et cetera, et cetera. There's not a single AFD cohort that looked the same. Some of them were a little dull and some of them were really fun, right? And it really depended on like who they were. And I think that that's important to note because as Allison was saying, like my dream is for nobody ever to ever need me, right? I don't want you to like be, you know, like need me for the rest of your life. I want to model what a healthy relationship looks like. I want to model what a community looks like. And then I want you to build the skills that you need in order to be in healthy relationships. And after that, I don't want you to need me. I want you to reach out when you're thinking about me, but like if you need me, I'm doing my job completely wrong, right? And I think that, like, again, we started by meeting people in court. And maybe, James, that's where we should start our conversation, to explain to people the big barrier of working with the AFD population, which I will name for people. So emerging adults, 18 to 26, usually very low education levels, very low employment rates, you know, not officially unhoused by Philadelphia standards, but often living on a couch or living, very transiently, right? So working with and very involved in street economies. And by street economies, finding ways, creative ways to make money, which I do not judge and I do not care about, aside from the fact that if any of the participants got rearrested during the program, they would get kicked out of the program by the judge in the DA's office. So limiting that risk of arrest. So, thinking about that, the first thing is that I look like me. Alison looks like herself. TJ looks like himself. And we got to make a 19-year-old North Philly kid want to talk to us about whatever is going on in his life, right? So James, do you want to start talking about like strategies that you're muted, that we would develop to like help people want to talk to us? You're still muted.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's the hardest part. That level of trust, meeting people for the first time, me knowing how that is, they didn't make it easy for us. The fact that we was in court and they hadn't been in there yet, they immediately associated us with the system. Those were their private conversations. I don't want really nothing to do with this. I'm only doing this because my lawyer said this. It was hard for them to even see the advantage of what we was trying to offer because of who was giving it to them. It's like if you're hungry, you're not taking food from a stranger. That's basically their position. We were hungry. We do want these charges to go away, but we don't want to take it from you guys. And on the first day in court, trying to convince people that this is what you want to do, that this is in your best interest, it shouldn't have been hard, but it was almost extremely difficult. They showed up for it, but signing on to us, that was a whole level of work because they didn't differentiate us between the prosecutor in the system. So that became, I think, one of our greatest challenges. But I think what helped us is the personalities of the people that was involved. I think when everyone, because we all went to different individuals. You get a person, I get a person, and we talk to them, and we bring them along. It was like right outside the courtroom, crazy boot camp, us trying to get them someone to help us help them. That was the hard part. And there were some conversations in which we had to actually have in order to get to that point. My background coming from the system helped me to a large degree because I was caught up in the system. And I assured them in no uncertain terms that they did not want to go to jail. I don't know what your plans are or how you think the system works. Some believe they want to go to court and fight the charge. And I'm like, that's not how the system is set up. It's whether you're innocent or guilty is irrelevant. You're in the system now, and then it determines what it does with you. So that was a hard battle, especially some of the kids, Noam, that we encountered. They come from so many different bad backgrounds in their life. Like some of the people that we had, their own mother never even told them that they loved them. We use certain terms like "we're proud of you" when they do certain things, a compliment. They never heard it. And they'll say, "Nobody ever said that to me in my life." I'm like, "What? Nobody ever told you they loved you?" He said, "My whole life, you're the first person that ever said it." Or she's the first person that ever said it. The first person even showed me that they cared. And a lot of them live sheltered life. The anxiety level is off the chart for the generations that we were dealing with.
But I think that, like, I think that you and I actually understand that impulse of not wanting to engage with people, right? Where I'm like, yeah, that's some bullshit. Like, prove it. If you prove it to me, maybe I will like believe you, but like you could say whatever the fuck you want to say, but like, what do you have to show for it, right? And I think that's like one of the things that like I don't think I had to teach you that, but I know I have to teach to a lot of people is like you can't say shit, promise shit, and then it doesn't happen, right? Because like disappointment is one of the number one triggers of our people because they're so used to being disappointed. And so it's really important that like you have to show up, right? You can't just say stuff. You have to actually show up and prove yourself that like if I'm telling you I'm calling you on Tuesday at 8:15, I'm calling you on Tuesday at 8:15, not 16, not 17. And they might not answer the phone because they're chaotic, but it don't matter. Like I have to actually do that, right? Or I think that like the people have to see the value of doing it, right? Like this kid, for example, like once he started saving money, right? Like then it started making sense to him why you would talk to me, right? Because it's not like I have a ton in common with this kid, right? But like I think that like as people start understanding and building on their own objectives and like the things that they actually want to do and get positive reinforcement or guidance, then it started making sense like why they would talk to us, right? But if you're just like just saying stuff, like who cares? Or like if you like mistake people like one person for another and like you kind of mix their names up or like you don't they're going to be like, oh great, I'm just a number for you. That's just what's happening, right?
You're only going to get one shot.
Yeah, you only get one shot and like you can't mess it up, right?
Once you lose that credibility, you'll never get it back. All of
Yeah.
us have our BS detectors, and they've been BS most of their lives. So the
Yeah.
minute that you fall into that category, you're not getting that person back.
Yeah.
And I always use this line from Long Day Journey into Night, where it says that no one can help the thing that life does to us. They're done long before they realize. And once they're done, they make us do other things, and soon we lose our true self forever. A lot of us have walked that path. No one wakes up as a kid, 5 or 6 years old, and say, I want to be a criminal, or I want to do this. There's the social structures in place that guide people into the direction that they go in. And you can tell someone, well, you made a choice. But if I got 3 choices and you got 7, then you got more choices to choose from than me. But I'm held accountable for the limited one that society made available to me. And I'm held to that same standard in the system.
Yeah.
And so that's where the unfairness come in at, because at the end of the day, we're all people and we all had the same basic goals and needs and desires.
Yeah. And I think that like, if we're going back to the social discipline window, I think that one of like the really difficult lines that we had to navigate all the time in AFD is like, yeah, I'm gonna love you unconditionally, but I will tell you that you're fucking up, right? And that specific thing I think is really difficult because like how do you do that without pushing somebody away, right? And I'm curious for you what that looked like to develop stronger boundaries
Yeah,
with participants.
having come through the system and been affected by it, you always want to do something to make it better for someone else. You don't escape anything and not be touched by it and then don't want to make it better and leave that hole there for someone else to fall in. A lot of us on the inside, we come to a lot of different realizations later on in life, and it's always the road not taken than the one that we end up falling in. So that level of trust that I'm just speaking about, that's hard to come to. It's very difficult to come to trust someone after most of your life you never had to trust anyone. And so it looks real weird from my perspective. And I actually saw it in the conversations and on the faces of the people that we encounter. No one really wanted to go into this. But once they got started and they see, that's the main thing about social work. Whenever you're working with people, period, it's authenticity. That's what people read more than anything else. And they can tell when someone cares about them and when they don't, because most of the life, no one ever cared about them. And you have to hit those marks. You have to hit those patterns. And when you finally bring someone around that know that the world is not as dark as they think it is, you made a difference in someone else's life. You changed them forever. And we watched them transform to the point where we see guys come before the judge in the beginning, even hard with the judge, hard with everyone. And in the end, them and the judge is crying because of the accomplishment that they did and the goals that they made. Some of them never had birth certificates, driver's license. They just never had the normal thing to navigate society. Yeah. And we encountered them and got them to that point. And I think when we do it, there's joy in it, even though the process is not easy. But when you finally help someone out, I think that's the ultimate reward, because I don't think there's any greater thing than basically saving someone's life. That's basically what you're doing, because it's going in another direction.
Yeah. And I think that like one of the big components of that program is like, of course, client work, but it's also convincing our stakeholders, including the district attorney's office and the not less conservative public defenders and judges, that what we were doing was not pure insanity. And so maybe this is our time to let TJ talk about that.
Thanks, folks. So yeah, one of the things that I hope is emerging from this discussion is the fact that it is a very multidisciplinary team. The community is part of the team. In fact, we had two different groups. One is the AFD group, but we have other groups. And we have a Wednesday night group, which we call the OG groups, the original group, right? Because that's folks like James, et cetera, who are now leaders at the center, community leaders, who we invite into our other groups as group facilitators. But also when I first, we had this model already in place, of course, before AFD started, because we've been working for several years before with various people who are at risk of incarceration. And it was important to have a structured protocol. In fact, before we started AFD, the chats and the gains protocol was identified by the National Academy of Sciences as an evidence-based, innovative, effective practice. And we were asked to host a national conference by the National Academies of Sciences to talk about this stuff. And the protocol, as you've seen, that has emerged, which consists, of course, of groups, weekly groups, case management, relational case management. Also, we have meetups, community meetups in parks, at art places. We reoccupy the social spaces we have all been segregated out of as part of the carceral process. And political engagement. We really have a lot of discussions around politics, around how to engage, vote or not to vote as a political message, who to vote for, how to vote. That was part of the process that we engaged in when we really helped on many levels, put Larry Krasner in office, which also helped us in this next stage that I'm going to talk about how we built connections with the system. But one thing that I also want to point out is we are in Philadelphia. One of the protocols that we use that has since become one of the things we've kind of got a little bit of national recognition for was we started using non-geographical site-based engagement, because it is actually not safe for folks who are living in Philadelphia to come to a geographical site which is known, where people will know where you are, especially if you're involved with the street economy, especially if there are guns involved. So we decided to kind of really explore how to diffuse that, and actually COVID accelerated that beautifully for us. And we went fully on Zoom. We established confidentiality protocols and taught people how to use Zoom and gave out free phones if necessary. And we continue to do that. And so that allowed us to become very, very intentional about how we form community, both online as well as the necessity to see each other periodically in the community, as a community. And this was a protocol that I was able to take when we were going. I was engaging with my folks. Alison was engaging with her folks. Noam was engaging with their folks, and and our other folks, James and Suave, and we have various elders in the community who were engaging with their folks. We were engaging with various stakeholders where we knew exactly what the protocol was. It's the Gaines protocol, it's the CHATS protocol, which is a CBT based motivational motivational interviewing based process that is deceptively simple. It's chats, but draws on all of these, and it's group based. So when I went and talked to the DA's office, for example, they instantly got why this was good for them, because I was able to say, listen, we're taking on the risk of assessing who's at risk, not you. Why would you do the clinical work of assessing risks to self and community? We're trained for that. Let us do that. And Larry was amazing in that. He was literally the first DA in the country to establish a gun diversion program. And it was quite eye-opening to have those conversations, because what it did was it allowed many DAs in that office to break with the early carceral system and start to kind of connect with us. Because they were part of a social justice system they've always wanted to be part of, but have never been allowed to be because of the logic of the carceral system. And however, there were this multidisciplinarity, which was not just within our groups, was reflected in the ways that we had to build multidisciplinary stakeholders who were part of this process structurally. And I'm telling you, I used group process for that. Those of you who have taken my group class, I know that you're here on this call, will know what I'm talking about. Groups are the center to what we do at the center. And often early on in the process, when I used to talk to the DA folks, they'd be like, well, why can't we just do case management one-on-one and do it? Because to them, the logic was, let's get people to these goals. One-on-one seems best. But of course, the goal here, I know you're rolling your eyes, those of you who have taken this class. The goal here is the process. It's not the substance, right? The goal here was the relationships that we built in groups, the accountability, but also the support, the political voice that we built in group. That happens every week. And so I would have to tell them, no, we gotta really insist on the group. The group is where the real gold is. And then when we took it to the next level of stakeholders, which were the judges, right? The judges were also very, actually, many judges were like, oh my God, these are gun users. We don't want to take on the risk of freeing them. But there were many judges, not surprisingly, many of them were Black women. But there are also some incredibly, progressive other judges, not just Black women, but a core group of them were Black women who really pushed for this. But even they would sit down like, why? In fact, they went one step further. When I was having the conversations with them, with Larry by my side and the DA's office and the PD's office there, I remember one conversation with a judge where she turns to me and says, why do we need social work at all? These are first-time offenders. What you're saying, you've convinced me that these folks are not people who are going around gunning down everybody. If you live in the city of Philadelphia, you're going to have to carry a gun if you're poor in some communities. That's not a situation where it's a pro-gun attitude. It's just something that people need to do to keep themselves safe so that other people don't jump them, because everybody knows whether you're carrying or not. And so when they get caught in the system, like they often do, then there is a way out if we don't criminalize them and keep them in the system. When I used to say this, the judges would, this judge, for example, I totally get that. Then why don't we just set some goals, some 6-month goals, and leave social work out of it? And in good group style, my urge, my ego, my as a social worker, my ego as a professor wanted to jump in and give her all the data on this. And I stopped because it was bad group process for me. She asked me the question. But the group completely stepped in. It was the DAs. It was the DA, in fact, in that particular, who was talking about this is treatment. And the PDs, the assistant DAs, the assistant PDs who were in that setting, who were coming forward and saying, no, this is accountability. They were talking about chats in a way that was much more powerful than if I had talked about it. These were the various modalities we engaged in to build the stakeholders. So the stakeholders, the multidisciplinary stakeholders at the structural level were surprising. There were judges there, and there were judges who changed how they judged. They would tell me, we've always wanted to do this. This is why we became a judge. We never got a chance to. So there was a judge who would cast off her robes and come and sit down in court during the status hearings and talk relationally with our folks and get excited about all, and our folks would get excited about sharing about what's going on and their families and their friends and getting jobs. And so it changed the punitive system to a system, and we always warn our folks, they're not your friends. So don't go sharing things just because you think that they're cool. But becoming cool was one of the ways in which the group worked to remove the punitiveness from it and to make it more a community. And everybody was really excited when people graduated. And, pretty much almost everybody graduated from the program. And everybody continues to be super excited that, touch wood, I always get a little, there you go, Noam, yeah. That, quite frankly, we've had just unbelievable rates of, connectedness in the community and, kind of moving away from the risk situations, taking the chats model out there and saying, yeah, I can get out. I do not have to go through that neighborhood. Maybe I have to move to remain safe, but it's more important to remain safe than to be part of this. Or maybe if I have to have a gun, maybe I need to figure out how to have it legally so that I don't get arrested and put in the prison, because that's the real harm here, is going to prison. So these are ways in which we have built the community. We have a vast network that has built up multidisciplinarily at the structural level. Our own graduate from the program is now actually part of the reentry services in educational services in CCP, Community College of Philadelphia. He's a coordinator there. So we periodically talk about this. He's in group sometimes. So, we talk about education as the next step, and many of our folks go the education route, which is really, for me, of course, as a professor, I'm like, yes, I'm biased about that. But it is quite exciting to see that, right? We have activist, connections to many community organizations, right? Like the Abolitionist Law Center, like various various projects and campaigns that work with various communities in the carceral region and carceral zone. And we really are discerning about trying to make sure we don't work with people who tick off the box, because that is part of what makes up the carceral system, is the way the social work system works sometimes around the funding of this. And there have been times when we have the other stakeholders, the important stakeholders here are the funders. We have gotten funding from various sources, from MacArthur Foundation, from Ford, from Schusterman, because everybody is excited to do this from an evidence-based practice way, and because of the stakeholders who are researchers, they know we have good data around this. But there have been times when we've had to tell funding stakeholders that, no, we can't do all of this schmoozing that happens nationally to go to conferences to build the system of legitimacy for reentry folks, because we don't have time. We've got to stay in Philly and do the work. We're a small group that works with hundreds of people, and we have to dedicate ourselves to the work. And so we've been told by that particular funder, for example, we are not going to get refunded, And so we've left thousands of dollars, at the table, because it's more important to us to not tick the box and do the work, not just because we're great people, but because this is an epidemic. And if not you, who? If not us, who, right? If not now, when? That's where we are with it. We are continuing to do much of this work every Wednesday, so in our groups. And I will kind of hand this over now to Alison to kind of summarize the points and the learning points here for us.
Thanks, TJ. Yeah, we want to leave the last, 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So I'm going to keep this brief, but we just wanted to kind of reiterate at the end some of the main points that we want to emphasize for everyone. So first, thinking about these strategies for strengthening positive attachment, as TJ demonstrated through the research, I think sometimes we think about attachment when we think about children, right? About young people, but what we found is this idea of attachment is so, so important for adults, and particularly young adults as well. And so these strategies for strengthening positive attachment, specifically all of the relational case management approaches, the opportunity to be together in groups, it really was so fun to see the way those relationships formed in the groups, even on Zoom, right? Like people really got to know each other. They would tease each other. They would remember what was happening with each other and ask questions. And, people really did express like, I've not had relationships like this. I've not had friendships like this. And so I think it's such an important opportunity. And again, just this community building for folks. Again, this kind of philosophical framework that we're working from, right? The abolitionist harm reduction, and these three principles that are most important. First, the social change principle, which was the social management versus social change, right? Is what I'm doing contributing just to the management of people and the management of needs, or am I really an agent for meaningful social change in what I'm doing? The multi-level change principle. So how can we be intervening at these different levels, at the individual and family level, at the community level, the system level, and even the sort of political structural level? And then this constant change principle, I was thinking about this in something that this kind of like joke that Noam sometimes tells to illustrate this idea that's like, how do you eat an elephant? And one bite at a time, right? And so I think sometimes when we're confronted with these massive problems of like mass incarceration and, poverty and racism and all these huge things, it's really easy to get frozen and to get overwhelmed. But I think kind of going back to this Harriet Tubman analogy and thinking about how actually like doing even things that feel like these small parts, the things that are in our scope, the things that are in front of us, and taking bites out of these systems, it actually is incredibly powerful, and it helps us to kind of get unfrozen when we feel totally overwhelmed by the scope and the magnitude of some of these problems. And then lastly, just strategies for interprofessional collaboration within the criminal legal system. It is not always easy. Sometimes we're coming from really, really, really different perspectives than people that we're working with. But I have to say, incredibly, I know we're all living in these polarized times, and it's not easy to sometimes form relationships across really different perspectives, but kind of always keeping the goal in mind, which is like the sustained freedom of the people we're working with. I think we've really been able to push ourselves to find ways to build those relationships. And so and really, I think it's been effective. And so just thinking about kind of the different strengths that folks bring from this social work perspective, from an activist perspective, James's work as, this peer person who's able to reach people who otherwise just, I really think we would have lost and we wouldn't have been able to connect with. And then again, these relationships with the system, all with this goal of structural change, ultimately towards freedom for folks we're working with. So I'm gonna end there. Only 2 minutes over. I'm feeling really proud about that. And we'll take some questions. And I think we'll enable the chat now.
Yeah, so I just have a real quick favor to ask of everybody. Please, 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 please only put questions in the chat. If you start doing the thank you, this was a great presentation, we can't find the questions in a constantly rolling chat. So do not type anything into the chat unless it's a question for her. And that just helps me out. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Maybe at
And
the very end, we can do the thank yous though, because that sounds
Yeah,
really fun.
exactly.
But yeah, okay, great. All right. Well,
Yeah. And the chat should be open now.
Thanks. We'll give folks a few minutes to see if there are any questions that come through. And
Well, while we wait for
Mhm.
people to ask questions, I do not like being painted in the light of being the hippie, superstitious person at the center. So TJ, you have to take that back. That is unacceptable. Like that you're this rational man and that I am like, woo-woo.
Busted. No, I was actually commenting on how accurate you are,
Thank you.
which makes me wonder about my orientation, which is terrible because I don't want to wonder about my orientations. We
One
have
of our most important rituals at the center is ganging up on TJ, but I see lots of questions coming through. Hi, Tracy. So Tracy was asking, how can we as clinicians support the initiative? Are you talking about like at the center specifically, Tracy, or in terms of kind of the abolitionist project in general? But we will come back to that one if we get a little clarity.
How should we do this, you think? Should we take it in a bunch at a time?
Yeah, I think what will happen is probably we'll have a few more questions and we're able to get to all of them. So I think we can try to maybe like grab onto the ones that sort of jump out as feeling like, you know, we can easier to answer, and then we can try to circle back around to some that we might need a little more time.
Yeah. Alison, are you leading us into answering the questions?
Yeah, why don't I'll throw this one out, and I think we can, yeah, I'll just toss one out first. So Michelle asked a question that I think is a good one for this group. Can you talk about how you cultivated a sense of community between group members?
Huh. Well, I feel like we're very good at modeling. I think that like, but you know, so you have a group, which all our groups were virtual, right? Like we would meet in the park and like we continue doing that with our participants, but we have been virtually facilitating groups since 2020. And so one of the big things is like, you know, people arrive in this group, and one of the roles of the facilitator is to model the culture of the center. And part of it is to show non-judgment, which is why I love when somebody starts by telling us that they're high in group or that they are smoking weed or whatever it is, so that we can model immediately what the culture of our group is, which is that I do not care about that. But then it's like all our participants share same experiences, and that's one of the beauties of having a group for people impacted by criminal justice, is that people always have things in common that they can share. The key is to get them to talk about it, right?
Yeah. I think that the humor, which is definitely like a big part of how we all relate to each other and how we relate in groups, has been a really important strategy. Like I was drinking coffee out of this mug before the presentation started, and Noam was like, Alison, you do realize that it looks like you're drinking wine, right? And I was like, oh no, because I promise it's coffee. I just have this fancy new like kind of clear mug. But we were remembering how I normally drink like iced black coffee in this little cup, and one time one of the group members accused me of drinking, what do you say I was drinking? Cognac? I forget.
Hennessy.
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 Okay. And
Brown
I was like, that's not it. But like, it was funny because everybody laughed. And I think, you know, I laughed along and it became a joke, and they tease me about it every week. But I think it just created this tone of like, it's okay for us to have a good time. Like, yes, you're sort of, you know, on some level voluntarily, but like mandated to this group, right? Like you're here because if you don't come here, you get prosecuted for illegal gun possession. And so there's a bit of a, and like, you know, I think undermining some of that vibe of like mandated by just having like fun together and letting it be okay to, you know, tell jokes and be silly, and also keeping boundaries in mind while we're doing that, right? It's not like, I think sometimes, you know, it's not a free for all in that sense. We are mindful of those things, but really being like actual humans. And I just want to say too about that roast, I did not offer to be roasted, but I ended up implicated in the roast.
I'm sorry.
And there are some like really funny looking redheaded cartoon characters that people kept dropping in the chat saying like I remind them of, and that has also scarred me for life, I would just like to say. So I think, but yeah, that humor part of things was really, I think, just setting the tone in the group, right? Like I think people come in and they're nervous. They're like, here's this group I was assigned to by court to not be prosecuted. And so when we can kind of create that vibe of like fun and connection, and
Yeah. I think the radical confidentiality is a massive way to establish trust. And I think they've seen us actually say no to judges, you know, like, no, that's not something we can share legally, very nicely. But if it comes to it, there will be conflict if there is. And I think we know exactly which side of the conflict we're on. We're not going to give up that. And that they've seen, and that helps a lot. And of course, it's not just from us. They've seen it in action, and then they're hearing about the stories that happen because they're exposed to those stories in groups, right? So that really is and we don't ask people to share. This is a very old in group, as some of you know, I'm really in many of my principles very Yalom-esque group process. I literally, encourage people to participate even with body language. And that's something that they share when they're ready for it.
Yeah, I was gonna say one of the things that people always tell us, and that's like not just AFD, it's in general, is like, I'm not a talker, right? Like that is like a classic line that we hear. I think that James, no offense, but you said that to me when we met each other. And I think that like there's always a brave one in the room who's going to say something, right? And sometimes something out of pocket. And people will pay attention to how we're reacting to that person who's saying the thing that's out of pocket, right? And I think that's like that really shifts also how people are going to be willing or not to engage in a group, right? If somebody is disclosing something, just to maybe give an example, I know we're maybe short on time, but like we had a participant who disclosed to us within like 2 months of the group that he was still involved in street economies, like selling drugs and carried a gun regularly, right? And in a lot of groups, that would be something that would be a pretty serious issue, or that would be handled like in a way that would be making people feel like they're being judged, right? And the group and the facilitators, which was me and Allison, what we ended up doing is really trying to do a lot of like strategy planning, like how do we keep you safe, right? Like what is the plan to keep you as safe as possible in this specific situation, right? And if I had been like, well, that's fucked up, you're carrying a gun, like I can't have you in my program, then that's a done bun. That kid is never going to change, right? But if we're able to be like, okay, I hear you. Why do you feel the need to have a gun? And he had very good reasons. Like all the reasons were very legitimate. But then how do you problem solve with somebody so that they can minimize their risk, right? And that really depends on like how you show up in that moment, right?
Yep.
And like people will pay attention to like your facial expressions and the tone of your voice and like the words that you're using. And it's really important to like be grounded in the values of like, okay, how do we deal with this in a way that like keeps you safe? Because that is the only thing that matters to me.
And I think, in some ways, those can be hard moments in group, but they can be the really important moments too, because everyone else is watching so closely when someone discloses something like that. And when they see that, they're met with like support and concern, that's one of the magic things about group, is that builds trust for everyone. So it's an interaction with one person, but the trust building happens with everyone. And what we've seen is that when we're able to kind of meet people where they are and meet people with the goals that they have at that time, they are more open as we move forward to thinking about other possibilities, right? So as we're down the road, kind of like, hey, what if you didn't have to carry a gun all the time? What would that be like? That conversation is really different when we've met someone where they are and respected their goals. Down the road, having those other kinds of conversations is more possible than when, if they're met with a hard line from us immediately.
Maybe that ties into a question I'm seeing in the list, which is about restorative justice circles and like the gun diversion piece, which is that like often systems want you to fix structural problems by believing they're individual choices. And that's just not true, right? Like gun violence in America is a structural problem. Like kids carrying a gun in Philly is a structural issue, not an issue of an individual choice. And that's kind of important to understand and to also like carry as we're dealing with like young people without judging them for carrying a gun, right? And which also is why police assisted diversion, in my personal opinion, and that doesn't have to be anybody else at the center, is pretty bullshit. But yeah. Sorry, TJ, you wanted to say something.
I was saying there was a quick question for James. Do we have time for a quick answer, James?
I think James did answer in the chat I saw.
Okay, okay.
And I think actually we do have to wrap up. There's so many great questions here, and I think we can maybe talk about how to get to some of those
Yes.
maybe after this session, but
I've just given permission for anybody to unmute themselves. It's a little more manageable. If anybody would like to ask questions, please feel free. I think we can take questions for a couple more minutes.
Good evening.
Or put them in the chat. Sorry, no.
Question in the chat.
Yeah, or say it out loud. That's fine too.
Okay. First of all, I enjoyed everything that happened this evening. I work for the city of Philadelphia in the warrant department. I want to know, how can I take this to where I'm working?
Would you want to tell us a little bit more about what you do at the warrant department?
In the warrant department, I'm a clerk typist one. I get calls from police officers in different counties. I verify warrants for the subjects and for the police officers. But a lot of times we have people call in for another person, and we're not liable to give that information to the person if it's not them that has the warrant. I work on the NCIC, that's also which we get calls from all over. If the state trooper makes a stop, we have to verify the warrant. We have to get a live scan in order for them to get the warrant sent to them.
The one thing that I think about, and maybe that's connected to a question that somebody put in the chat, is this question of like being trauma informed, which is not a term I love, but I'm thinking about what does it look like to let everybody that you interact with hold their dignity in the interaction, and even like people, who are like, friends who are like trying to get like the person's like information and you can't do it. But what does it look like to have this interaction in a way where everybody can hold their dignity and feel like they're held with care and respect,
Mhm,
which sometimes feels really small, right? And
mhm.
like feels kind of like useless, but actually like, and I feel like maybe James can talk about that because I think we've talked about it before, is actually like can be life-changing for people to just have an interaction where they're treated like with dignity. James, you're muted, just so you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because when you go through most of your time not being seen, which is why we have numbers and referral by our last name only, is because there's a disconnect. And they tell people that working in the system because you don't want to get close. Because if you get too close, that means you got to care. They don't
Right,
want you to care.
right.
So this is the net that helps people deal with their job. Because I ask people that's involved in this kind of work, what do you do to decompress? How do you deal with what you deal with? Because you do take on a lot, and even though you're part of it, you're sitting there, you're just doing your job. The perception is that you also are part of the system because you're behind that desk, not knowing that one act of kindness, as Noam said, that will be enough for that person to see you and separate from what their normal perception is of that person. And you want to be seen as doing your job, but you also want to be seen as being able to see someone else as well, because they make your job easier when they can relate to you and see you in that position instead of the brick wall that most people encounter.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm saying it
Because
can't.
a lot of times when
Oh,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, a lot of times when a person calls in, because I don't like to call them subjects, but
Mhm.
that's the term that we use.
Mhm.
They always have a story.
Yeah.
Everybody has a story, and it's not that I choose to disrupt their story or ignore their story, but the phone is constantly ringing, so it's not like I can sit and
Yeah.
counsel them, so to speak.
Yeah.
I have to ask them, listen, when is your date of birth? What is your last name? And I don't want to feel like I'm rushing them or like getting them off the phone, but really that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think,
Yeah.
go ahead,
Go
Noam.
ahead.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
No, I just was gonna say, like, I think also you started the program this fall, right, Lisa Marie, or this summer?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. I started on the 26th.
On the 26th. Yeah,
Yes,
welcome.
ma'am.
I'm glad you're here. I think
Thank
also
you.
like these are great questions that you're asking, and I think the answers are a process, right? And I love that you're like in the, in the program and kind of at the beginning of some of that journey, because I think that'll be a question that you'll probably keep evaluating throughout, but I think like Noam and James kind of talked about that idea of like centering dignity, and I have found that, I've been able to make things work sometimes at jobs that like from the outside might not look like I would necessarily be able to practice in the way that is sort of aligned with my values, but sometimes I've been able to like fly below the radar and do certain things in spaces that I wouldn't have expected. Other times I've been in jobs where I felt like this just doesn't align and I just can't
Mhm.
practice the way that I want to and kind of feel is important here. And so I move on. And I think those are questions that we sometimes just have to sort of keep alive and keep working through. But I love that you're asking those questions. So keep them in mind and we'll keep talking. I think we Janae hit us with a question. Maybe we'll end with this one, Janae, but we can, as Dr. Tennille said, maybe we can think about doing a kind of a follow-up Q&A recording for folks, because these are such thoughtful questions. But Janae asked, one thing that stands out for me in the center is how you don't collect a lot of information on people or do huge biopsychosocial assessments that a lot of us are used to in social work. It really changed the idea for me about what you need to know about a person in order to provide help or support. And understanding that as a social worker, just because we are in a helping capacity, we should not automatically have access to all the info in a person's life just because they are accessing the center for services.
Ooh. Yeah. I have a lot of things to say about this one personally. I think that a biopsychosocial is bullshit, but that again, I am not a trained social worker. But I think that like this is a big part of relational case management is like I only get to know the things that people want to share with me. Right. And that is like, and there's like a power dynamic that shifts a little bit. Like the power, I still have a ton of power, but I also have to then like figure out how to get the things that I need in order to understand somebody. And I think that like, especially when you're working in the criminal system, there's this idea that lawyers operate from, which is you don't ask a question you don't want to know the answer to. Which is kind of important, right? Like there are certain things that like lawyers do not want to know the answer to, right? Because like when you're thinking about like what's the word I'm looking for? Counter thing, DA, whatever. And so it's kind of James was not helping me here, which was a little rude, but whatever. But that's kind of important actually. And I think that if we're going back to the trauma-informed lens, like what does it mean for somebody to understand that they have the power to tell you what they want to tell you, right? And how does that shift their relationship with you, right? That's a huge deal. And I would also argue, and then I'll shut up, that like we all lie and lying can be really healthy. And I have like no moral judgment about lying. And I actually think that people lying to me, like I always assume that everybody's lying to me and not from like a judgment perspective, but just from a like, that's just a fact in life. And that really allows me to kind of release a lot of like expectations and a lot of the punitive idea. Like, just because I'm helping you doesn't mean that I'm owed the truth. Like, that is something that in an actual relationship with somebody that is in my life and that I care for is something that we're going to work on together in the container of our relationship. But like, if I don't come from the place of like assuming that, like, because I have power, you will tell me the truth, then like we have to actually navigate and I have to be more of an active participant in the building of the relationship. And that really shifts things.
Also, just to add to that, part of this is that these massive assessments have been brought in. If you look at the history of how we do things in social work, it's been brought in by insurance. It's been brought in by a lot of liability issues. There are great social work orientations like, narrative therapy, solution focused, or group process, where the here and now and the narrative of socially constructing histories and manifesting it in the relationship are really prioritized. Those have just been kind of sidelined by this medicalized process of having trying to replicate medical models as if the liability is less and the accuracy is more, which is not necessarily true. So I think you're on to something that's deeply social worky. I wish we were more true to our origins sometimes, but yeah, hopefully we can be in the future.
Yeah.
And also that means that you get to ask questions to people, and it's important to
Right.
actually just ask somebody what you want to know about them, because then you care about them. It's really not that complicated.
On that note, I think we'll wrap up tonight. Thank you all. And Janae, yeah, thank you for raising that that question and all the other amazing questions. And we'll see if we can make a plan to get to those. So thank you all. Have a great night.